A special thank you to the Archie Bray Foundation for sponsoring this episode of Tales of the Red Clay Rambler. The Bray Clay business is your best source for Braypoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Braypoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. To place your order, call us at 406-442-2521 or order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com.
Welcome back to episode 504 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with artist and plinth gallery owner Jonathan Kaplan. Over more than 50 years in ceramics, he's worked as a studio potter, manufacturer of commercial ceramics, and gallery owner. In our interview, we talk about investing in yourself, knowing when change is needed to avoid burnout, and how Kaplan approaches geometric forms through mold making. His book, The Mold Making Manual, was just released this year by the American Ceramic Society and weaves his personal narrative into practical mold-making skills. For more information, you can visit plinthgallery.com. I'm excited to have a live taping of the show happening next week at this year's NCECA conference. I hope you'll join me Thursday, March the 21st at 2:30 for a conversation with Lisa Giuliani and Brian Kakas about the changing landscape of ceramic education. Directly after that, at 4 p.m., guest host Malene Barnett will be recording Clay Roots Exploring Ceramics Across the Black Diaspora with Mapo Kennard, David McDonald, and Ashlyn Pope. I hope you'll be in attendance for both of those, and as well as this show's recordings, there will be 6 other recordings that are going to be happening in room B10 on Thursday and Friday. So if you'd like to be a part of that, there's going to be episodes of The Potter's Cast, For Fleck's Sake, Wheel Talk, The Maker's Playbook, and Trade Secret. For more information, you can go to NCECA.net. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview.
So there was a moment in your early life, I listened to another interview with you, and you talked about you'd gotten in some trouble at school. I think you described it as you were underachieving.
I was a supreme underachiever. I was I was a very big underachiever. And, I tested really, really well, but, it just wasn't. I would get B's and C's, but never any A's. And I was always hanging around with the wrong group of kids and getting in trouble. And my mom and dad gave me 3 choices. They said, you can go to a military school. That was totally not going to happen. You can go to a Jewish day school, a yeshiva. That was even more not going to happen. And then they said, well, tomorrow, why don't you go over to Manhattan, take the train up from Grand Central to Poughkeepsie, and go to this interview we've set up for you at a coeducational Quaker boarding school. So I did. I had my interview. I fell in love with the place, and that's where I did my last 2 years of high school in a private coeducational Quaker boarding school. There was a class of 30 that graduated in 1968, and it was where I was first exposed to ceramics.
we're going to delve into that, but I want to just imagine you had a different life. Because I think about these pivotal points in the career of anyone. Like if you would have gone to the military school, you almost certainly would have gone to Vietnam because of the
Of course.
timing. If you'd gone to the yeshiva, your experience would have been completely
Oh my
different.
gosh. Yeah. Completely different. I never would have found ceramics. I would, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk though about knowing when you're on the right path, because you were young, you were a teenager at the time, but when you find ceramics, that is often the time in which you get purpose in life. So can you talk about like sort of finding your lane early and then going forward to do more education in ceramics?
I had a year of ceramics at Oakwood School in Poughkeepsie, New York. And the first time I watched somebody throw on a potter's wheel was watching the teacher, Mrs. Willis, do it. And I said, I have to learn that. First time I sat down on a wheel, I kind of knew that this was what I wanted to do. It was one of those moments, and I spent all my free time in the ceramics studio. And for a graduation present, my mom and dad provided an opportunity for me to go to Alfred University for summer school. And I had never heard of that, Alfred. And after researching it, I found out it was the New York State College of Ceramics. So I was all in, and it was quite the summer. All the people who we kind of venerate in our craft, Val Cushing, Dan Rhodes, Bob Turner, they were all there at that time. And I had glaze calculation with Val Cushing. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better introduction to that. And there were two other people, David and Judy Cornell, who took up the rest of the program. And John Nickerson was the guy who showed everybody how to throw correctly. And they had a plaster lab there, and I turned to plaster part. And then that was over, and it was time to go to undergraduate work at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where I wanted to do work that would get me into a pre-med program. I wanted to be a doctor. Well, in Cleveland, right around the corner from me, was the Cleveland Institute of Art. And of course, I wanted to be there. So I signed up for night school, and it was one day a week. My first instructor was Roger Lang, who ended up here in Denver after a couple years in Cleveland. And then I had two instructors there, Joe Zeller, who became my mentor, and David Batts, both extremely knowledgeable and wonderful potters, worked totally in different ways, but they both made beautiful pots. And there I was exposed to, they would go to summer art fairs, and between Ann Arbor and Lakefront and some other shows, they would go with a full van and come back with an empty van. And that was a good model for me. I said, that's what I wanted to do. And I was studying architecture at Case Western. I built a small studio in my basement and built a wheel and built a gas kiln in the backyard. And both Joe Zeller and David Batts looked at me one day and said, you have to either do this professionally, get some education, or just, continue to come here to night school. So I applied to art school, and I got into Rhode Island School of Design, and that's where I did my undergraduate work. And I followed that up with graduate work at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. And that was my academic career, my academic educational career.
So this time in ceramics, as you mentioned, when you were at the summer school at Alfred, you were studying with some of the sort of preeminent glaze experts and folks that were writers of books. I wanted to see if you could just tell us a little bit about how you perceived that era as a younger student. But so, like, for instance, you mentioned that professors could go or artists could go and make a living, make a good amount of money at a summer art fair. Now, and when I graduated graduate school in the middle of the great financial crisis, like none of that was on the table. Like things were not looking good. So what was the outcome when you were looking forward as a person in your young 20s trying to set up a career?
Well, we also have to look at being at the right time at the right place, which has been something that's always been present in my ceramic career. And the timing was the late 60s and early 70s, and art fairs were new and novel. There was no one that I knew wholesaled pots. They all made all this work and went to summer art shows. I was in the right time at the right place. And after graduate school, I was one of the few who did not get a teaching job. And it was fortuitous that I didn't, because my career would have developed totally differently. I had a residency at a small school in Pennsylvania. And in return for making clay, firing kills, and teaching a beginning class, I was able to make stuff. And this was in southeastern Pennsylvania, which was the right location at the right time. And all these shows started to spring up around Baltimore and Washington, D.C. And these were retail shows. I think there was a series of shows like Sugarloaf Mountain Group or something. There was State College, Pennsylvania. There was WBAI show in New York around Christmas time. And then ACC, the American Craft Council, started to do, the Rhinebeck show had been in existence for a while. It started in Bennington I think it was the mid 60s. And then when it outgrew the space at the Bennington Fairgrounds, it moved to the Dutchess County Fairgrounds in New York State, just north of Manhattan by about 50 or 60 miles. And there were wholesale days and retail days. And there were artists from every possible craft you could imagine. They were all juried. It was a very high quality show. And the first 2 days were wholesale, and stores and galleries came and they placed orders, and I knew what I could make in a month and spaced out my deliveries accordingly. Then there was a break day. There was a barbecue and you could socialize. And then it was 3 days of frenetic retail. But also remember, it was a time and a place. Then when American Craft Council started American Craft Enterprises, and they did their Baltimore show, which was the winter market of American crafts back in the day, at the Baltimore Convention Center. That bridged the gap between the late spring, early summer show at Rhinebeck, and this show was in February. And of course, they were all juried, and you had to have good slides. Back in the day, they were slides. There were no digital cameras. And you just put your best work forward and hired a photographer and submitted it with your $25 application fee and hope you were juried in. And I was lucky. I was juried in from 1977 all the way through 1968. And it provided a stable source. I didn't mind wholesaling pots. It was not a matter of, well, it's, half the price of retail. Well, if you do the numbers, the wholesale price should be twice what it cost you to make it. So you work the numbers and you found a way to make it work. And at that point, I was making a line of stoneware pots, very indicative of that time. They were solid forms and solid glazes, fired at cone 9, cone 10 reduction. And myself and my partner, Jan Hewling, we couldn't make enough work. We had one assistant, and we delivered pots in the spring and summer, mostly up to the New England area, around Cape Cod. And that was also a vacation. And then we came back and made more pots. I then realized that I needed some help in the studio. And rather than hire people to throw, I bought a jigger machine. And it was the second, I think, to the best of my knowledge, I was the second person in the United States who was jiggering pots. And I learned how to make the molds, and I could design work, make a master, and it was a really good production tool. If you design your work correctly, all those things are tools. It's just a tool like a slab roller, like a wheel. And the same thing was true of a hydraulic press that was later to come, but not in my first studio.
Part of this business plan is it's high volume. So you mentioned that you needed to make a lot of work. You had an assistant, you had your partner. How, though, did you think about that work in the marketplace? Because you can make more pots and you can price them competitively, but that's a business decision, not an aesthetic decision. So how did you think about all of that aesthetically?
I knew that I could make good work. I also knew that the world was awash in pretty mediocre work. And if I could always make the best work I could that had form and had design, and it was all about the intent of the work. And I based it pretty much around a mug. Back in those days, and this may come as a shock to many people, I wholesaled mugs for $4.50.
Wow.
And, you had to buy a dozen. And those would be in a retail store for $10 or $12. And it was fine. On the $4.50 mug, it cost me under $2.25 to make that mug. And I made 144 mugs every Monday. And I just worked to build inventory. At that point, I became friendly with a potter in Texas whose name was Tom Mason. And Tom was a prodigious production potter. It was he and his wife, Sue, and it was Mason Holder Stoneware. And they were prodigious potters. They were in so many stores. And Tom became quite a role model for me, as well as someone you might have heard of, which was Bill Campbell. And Bill was in the western part of Pennsylvania and always had an open door policy to his studio. And he taught me how to make jigger molds and was always an excellent, excellent resource. So those were the guys. There was another guy named Bob Crystal who made beautiful, beautiful throne pots. And in those days, at the Baltimore show, I don't know the exact numbers, but there were a core group of people making usable work. And all the work was different. It all had a different appeal. And it was all pretty much, pricing was consistent. I never thought that my prices were out of line. I would sell a teapot for $22 wholesale. with a cane handle.
Do you remember about what your rent would have been at that time for the studio space?
Oh, of course, of course. I was really lucky. I had this residency in South Central Pennsylvania, and it was a beautiful place to be. And one day, my partner Janet and I drove around, and we found this funky little town between Lancaster and Reading, Pennsylvania. And there was this warehouse with a for sale sign on it. So we called the realtor, we made an appointment, and it was $12,500
Oh
for a
my God.
3,000 square foot warehouse. It was 2 levels above the ground, one fully finished stone basement with a hand-drawn elevator with a big rope. And I bought it. And over the next year, we converted it into a live workspace and a gallery. And that was my first studio. It was in Bowmansville, Pennsylvania. It was maybe 50 minutes from Philadelphia. It was, a couple hours to Manhattan, a couple hours to DC, a little less to Baltimore. So I was in the right place at the right time.
And I've heard you talk about the volume of work you were making at the time. So $12,500 for that building, like you could pay that building off quickly, like in a couple years making.
Oh, indeed, indeed, indeed. I had saved some money, so I bought it. There was no mortgage. No, there was a mortgage, and it was $82.22 a month. I remember that. And there was no natural gas in town, so I had a big 1,000-gallon propane tank. And I built I think the kiln probably stacked about 60 cubic feet. It might have been 80 to 90 cubic feet total. It was 4 shelves deep. They were 14 by 28. And you could stand inside the kiln. And fired that every week. I had 2 electric kilns that we bisque pots in. And I worked towards building inventory, towards building enough inventory to fill the orders. I knew how much I could make a week and in a month. And that then determined how much I could sell. But just remember, it was a time and a place it will never be repeated. The kind of market that was available then, it was emerging, and I was very lucky to participate in that market.
Yeah, and I think it also shows that if you can ride that initial wave of an emerging market, that you can invest in yourself. Because we're going to talk about the other sort of eras of your career, but you seem like you've been good at saving money and then reinvesting into your own businesses. Did someone teach you that, or was that like just your instinct to be?
No one. No, my father would always ask me, "Can you earn a living?" I said, I don't know until I try it. My mentor, Joe Zeller, earned a living. He earned a good living. He also had a teaching job. But, those days of going to Ann Arbor, the Chicago shows, you could do $5,000 or $6,000 in a weekend, which is minuscule compared to some major retail shows like the Cherry Creek show nowadays. If in the early days, if I went to a retail show and came back with $1,000, that was $300 a day. That was a huge show.
Because what I'm trying to wrap my head around is you've talked about right place, right time. And some of that is just the value of the money relative to inflation. So if you have a $6,000 fare and your building costs $12,000, then you're great. Like that's just an amazing thing. But I do want to point out, though, that you had the instinct to save the money at the right time and then spend the money at the right time. And I think that's often hard for potters or for artists in general, is to know when to save and know when to spend, because we can't see the future.
My father always encouraged me to save money. And back in those days, living expenses were affordable. relative to its time. And, we would come back from a show and you'd separate your money. Here's the credit cards that you manually ran. Remember the imprinter?
Yep.
Okay. So there were the credit card slips, there were checks, and there was cash. Well, checks and credit cards went to the bank. Half the cash went to the bank. The other half went to a vacation fund and never got deposited. But I always kept my eye on the prize, and how after my first couple of shows, I knew that there was a marketplace. And I also knew that there was only so much I could physically make. I mean, I was, of course, much younger then and had, my days started early at 5 a.m. and they ended, whenever. I would often work at night. We had a calendar and we knew the orders that were due on X date and X date. And we knew they had to be ready. And I always tried to use used boxes from the liquor stores. And eventually I learned how to pack correctly. After losing the first couple of shipments, I learned how to pack. And I still use the same method today.
We're going to define that as kind of like the first wave of your career. And that eventually led to burnout because it's hard to sustain that volume. Then you stop, you end up moving like many people to the mountains because it's beautiful. So could you talk about making that decision to stop?
It was really easy for me. At that point, I was pretty well burned out. And it was time to get out of Dodge. And I had grown up skiing. And I knew that maybe I should go live in a ski town. So I moved to Telluride, Colorado, in the southwestern part of the state. It's very funky, yet most beautiful mountain town. Worked in ski shops and bike shops. I skied and biked every day. And that lasted for 2 years until there was an opportunity to invest in a bike shop in Steamboat Springs. So I moved to Steamboat Springs. That opportunity didn't happen, but because I had experience in ski shops, I worked in ski shops. And it was a very interesting life. I brought years of people skills that I learned at craft shows to how to deal with 20 people in front of the counter, all having spent massive amounts of money to get to ski towns, to spend a lot of money to ski. And they were, always impetuous and always, wanted, I'm first in line. And I could deal with that. I got to the point where I didn't see any future in a recreation industry. I could end up managing a store, but it still wouldn't be mine. And I decided maybe I should go make pots again. So I found some industrial space, a little outside town. It was 1,000 square feet. And I had put some of my things from my Pennsylvania studio in storage. I had work carts, pug mill, wheel, and all my books. And I brought them out and I went to the model that I had known, which was making pots, going to shows, wholesale shows, and selling to stores. What I didn't realize that the market for handmade pots, I can't say handmade things because I don't know what the other markets were, but the pottery market was on a slow decline. And this was in 1990, 1991. And I went and did the Baltimore show. I did the New York gift show. Going from Colorado to the East Coast, you'd ship a crate, you'd fly or you'd drive. It was not easy. And not getting a really solid return on my investment, I knew there needed to be, there was another way. And At a show, another craftsperson asked me if I could make these terracotta perfume bottles. They were small and they had a stopper. And I said, sure. How many do you want? She said, 300. Yeah, sure, I can make them. So I made the models. I had a little bit of plaster skills, learned a lot, made the 300. And before I knew it, I was the guy in the mountains who could manufacture giftware, who could manufacture. I mean, my clients were potters, were other artists, were business people that had ideas for things that could be made in ceramics. And I had employees. I had payroll. I added another 1,000 square feet, bought a hydraulic press. And I was the mold guy. I had a production manager, an accountant. I think I had 4 or 5 employees. It wasn't big. It was manageable. But I didn't have time to make my own pots, make my own work. I had no idea what my own work was or could be at that time. And as the years added on, I was able to cultivate a little bit of space to make my own work. And I started slip casting terracotta teapots. And, some were functional, some were not. They all were vessels. They all had that thing of containment. But they were mostly decorative. They were art pieces. And eventually, as the 15th and 16th year of being a manufacturer rolled on, I knew I couldn't do this for forever. I had wonderful employees, but it was time to go. And I thought about moving to the East Coast, and it's just a little too far. And in Denver one day, I was driving around and got a little lost, but I ended up in a section of Denver just north of downtown. And there was this old warehouse and with a sign for sale by owner. I think it said 3,000 square feet includes apartment. Called the guy up. He came over. I bought it the next week. And it was affordable at that time. Did I have a vision what it could be? Yeah. The existing usage was a head shop. The guy had a glass blowing operation. He made pipes and bongs. And the front space was the Acapulco smoke shop. And he sold accessories. And it was time for him to sell his building. So I was just at the right place at the right time. Little did I know that it was in an arts district. Little did I know that it would develop the way it has developed. It's the River North Arts District in Denver. There are makers, galleries, artists, dispensaries, restaurants, clubs. It's a true entertainment district as well as an arts district.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. Well, before we talk more about that third act, how did your definition of yourself change through the first iteration, the second iteration, the third? That first time, did you call yourself a potter? How did you self-define through these progressions in your ceramic life?
At first, I was a potter. And then when I moved from Pennsylvania and ended up with a manufacturing business, I was a manufacturer. I was the factory guy. But I had these skills that I have no idea where I learned. I mean, I'm self-taught as a mold and model maker. I read everything out of a couple of books and made many mistakes, lost some money in the process, but figured out how to do this and how to make duplicates of ceramic objects. I had to learn a lot about casting slip and its chemistry and the rheology of how it all works. And so then I was a manufacturer. There were clients who came to me and said, I have an idea. Can you make this ceramic widget? And I said, well, I can only visualize in my mind what you're talking about. So maybe find somebody that could do a drawing and send it to me. I can't tell you how many drawings on the back of napkins I got. And I had some mechanical drawing skills. This was before computerized drawing. And I could draw the piece and make it manufacturable. You know, not everything can be manufactured. And I would submit the drawings to the client, and I'd get the approval, and I'd work a budget out, and there was the cost of the tooling and the cost of each product and shipping. So at that point, I kind of said, you know, I'm a manufacturer, but I'm also a designer. I can bring those qualities of what I value in work that is well designed, work that had art to it. It wasn't just a manufactured item. I could bring my skill and expertise and my eye to developing a product for a customer that was really good. I mean, some of the things I made there was lots of them. And some of them were really interesting. There was a potter in Rhode Island who made an item called, his name was Harry Spring from Spring Pottery. And he made this bowl. It was about a 14-inch diameter bowl. It's called the Love Bowl. It had a big flared rim, and in size letters around on the inside of the rim, it said, love is the only ingredient you'll ever need. So you'd glaze the whole thing, you'd scrape the glaze off the rim, and I'd have this beautiful blue bowl with those runny, rutile kind of glazes. And here was this rim with the saying on it. And that kept me busy for a long, long time. So, you know, there were potters, there was a guy who grew miniature roses and wanted a miniature pot for this. And it was the first project I did, and they were $1 each. And he wanted 10,000. And I just saw the 10,000 as that's a lot of money. I didn't realize the amount of work that was in it.
Yeah, and I think manufacturing has just such a different context. You know, like most of the people I talk to are studio potters. In the studio potter business model, if you had an employee, it might be an assistant to help you mix glaze, not someone like you that was hiring, you know, manufacturing labor, which is a whole, you know, different thing.
Once you make a transition to assisted technologies, as it was called in that time, slip casting, jiggering, hydraulic pressing, those were things that I could delegate because I made the originals, I made the tooling, and someone who had no experience, I could show them how to use the jigger machine, how to pug the clay, how to pull the arm down correctly. The same thing is true of the hydraulic press. And it was just finessing those skills on how to make this. The molds, the dies, the tooling, the fixtures, they were all done. But there was significant handwork in every piece. I mean, you had to remove the seam. You had to buff it out. You had to detail the foot. There was so much handwork after that.
In the third act of your career, you've now moved to Denver, which you talked about, bought another building, and have a gallery, Plinth Gallery, which a lot of people will know you as the guy from Plinth.
I'm the guy from Plinth. I'm not Mr. Plinth, but I'm the guy from Plinth.
Yeah. So can you talk about the desire? Because I think about it as like you went from potter to manufacturer. Now you're also a maker, an artist, you're still making, but you're also advocating for ceramics within the greater Denver area. So can you talk about kind of taking that on, the mantle of being an advocate within that bigger community?
Well, there's a long history of ceramics in Denver, yet there were no venues that were exclusively ceramics. There were stores that had a corner and they had some pictures and mugs, but there was no gallery that was exclusively devoted to collectible ceramics. And when I walked into this building and I saw this front of the building that was the head shop, I knew that this could be a gallery space. And originally, after I renovated the building, I hired an architect and we designed the whole thing. And it was originally just going to be a gallery for my work. But I knew that I could not sustain my work to be new and different all the time. And coming from a wholesale and retail ceramics background, I knew a lot of people. And it just seemed natural to me to provide a exhibition venue for accomplished artists, for up-and-coming artists, for mid-career artists, and have it carefully curated by me. And that's kind of how it started. There are two venues for collectible ceramics in the entire state of Colorado. One is in Aspen, and the other is here in Denver, which is Plinth Gallery. And I'm really lucky to have this opportunity to help people sell their work, and people who have, some of my exhibitors are this is their first time. So, it sets the plinth or the base for helping them move their career if they're so inclined.
And I think the name of the gallery also hints towards your own artistic vision, which is architecture. Like when you look at your work, the stuff, the art that you're making now is very architecturally referenced. So can you talk about what you're interested in the studio now?
My main interests stem from an interest in architecture and geometry. And it also stems from a book called The Pattern Language by the author was Christopher Alexander. And this was a book on architecture, and it was how early cultures built and designed their buildings for specific purposes. And there were certain patterns in how they designed their buildings. And that became a pattern language in early architecture. And I knew that there was something very similar about a pattern language that I could bring to the work that interested me. I had a really anemic start making ceramic work here in Denver. I made some really bad pots. But it helped me get to this place where I have this idea. All my work is slipcast, and I use found objects as well as objects made from models that I make. I do full-scale drawings, and I know how to make the models for these pieces. And they're all assembled. They're large vases. They're about 30 to 40 inches high. And they're all fairly structured with a base, a plinth. There's a midsection, a transition section, and then there's a tall form on top of that. And some of the items have donut handles or other types of attachments. I've always been very fond of the donut shape and realized how difficult it was to be able to throw them and trim them. And then I found the stackable kids' toys that were donuts and plastic donuts, and I made molds of all of those. And slip casting has allowed me to think and do in another direction that is not limited by the process. There is a tremendous freedom in wheelwork. I understand that, but the process in and of itself can be fairly constrained. Slip casting has no constraints for me. If I see it, if I imagine it, I can draw it, I can build it.
In a lot of ways, you have the benefit of, 50 plus years of making ceramic objects. So the problem solving abilities you have now compared to what you had 40 years ago as a beginning potter or a early businessman potter, I'm sure it's so different.
Oh, it's way different. It's way different. I don't think as a potter thinks. I mean, I think about forms and I think about shapes, and I think about surfaces and finished piece, but I don't necessarily think of myself as a potter. I use pottery techniques. I use ceramic techniques to make the work that I'm interested in. And it could be slip cast, it could be hand built. What I have now is the ability and the skill set to make any object. To me, I look at slip casting as it's a problem-solving process. Not that it's problematic. It's a process of solving design ideas. So if you have an idea, you can throw it, you can hand build it, you could slip cast it. You could jigger it, you could jolly it, or you could choose not to make it at all.
That's right. You could just think it in your mind.
You can just think it.
Well, I want to talk about a book that you've written and was recently released about mold making. Like you've accumulated all this experience as an artist and as a maker over all these years and decades. But when you're trying to teach that to someone else through a book, how did you approach teaching a beginner how to think in the way you think?
Well, I knew that if I didn't write a book, all the stuff, all the knowledge, all the skills that I had accumulated would die with me. I'm not quite sure that in higher education, there is the kind of curriculum and knowledge that can be devoted to plaster as a design tool. And so I decided, I thought about writing a book for 20 years and never could find the time, never could figure out how to do it. Once I decided I wanted to write a book, I knew the first thing was to find a publisher. So I approached the American Ceramic Society at an NCECA show and talked to their book person. And she said, yeah, we don't have a book on plaster yet. Yeah, we could do that. Send me something. I didn't have anything written at the time. So I went back and I just wrote some stuff down and, edited it and they liked it. And they said, here's a contract. This is your timeline. We're here to answer any questions. I didn't know how to write a book, but I knew I needed an outline. And the most laborious part of writing the book was developing the outline and understanding that the outline is a fluid thing. Because as you go through and write about each of these topics, you may encounter something that you didn't put in the outline. So now there has to be space for that because it's part of the knowledge. And I think what differentiates the book that that I wrote and the other mold books that are out there, which, by the way, are all really good books. They all provide information. And what they did not address was where do these shapes, where do these forms come from? And and how do you develop a form? And so I talked a lot about what are called geometric primitives, which are spheres, cubes, cylinders, pyramids, and everything in ceramics or everything that's designed can kind of be looked at as coming from a geometric primitive. Basically, you take a sphere, you cut it in half, you put a lid in it, a spout in it, and a handle on it, you have a teapot. So I talk a lot about how you develop form from looking at geometric primitives and understanding the Cartesian coordinate system, which is the X, Y, and Z axis. I'm not a really good draftsman. I can mechanically draw anything. The gentleman who did the illustrations for my book, which I could not have done the book without him, Tom Mason, who used to be a potter, but he's so skilled in all of the drawing and illustration programs that I could send him a sketch. I could give him a 5-minute phone call, and the next day, here would be this incredibly rendered illustration. And without those illustrations, I mean, the book is full of photographs, but the illustrations really tell the background. They're the backbone of how to make stuff. And it's all a design process. And when you think if you think as in this case, a ceramic designer, rather than thinking as a potter, it's not better or not worth, it's just or worse, it's just another way of thinking, because the goal would be, if you're a manufacturer, you need to make reproductions. In my case, I know how to make models and molds. I'll make a couple molds of each, but and they're all forms that I can combine. I don't have to make 15 mug molds, because that's not where my interest is. Although I do have them, and I make mugs for the Arts District, and they have the River North Arts District logo on it. But I'm really privileged to have this book. I'm honored. It was 6 years of work. It was 4 years to write and 2 years of editing. And it was a constant back and forth between, my email and the emails of the American Ceramic Society. And, they kept steering me in the right direction. The book is done in a narrative way. It's a narrative of my career as a mold and model maker and a maker of ceramic objects. And I knew if I told the story, if I couched it within a narrative, it would be a story rather than this is how you do it. It's more than a how-to book. I've written for publications before, so I can write reasonably well, and I can edit myself, but it's always good to have somebody else look at your stuff. I had no idea how they would edit what I sent. And as it turned out, what they edited was for continuity, where the images went, grammar, syntax. They didn't edit the content. They might have changed a few words. I tend to be overly wordy in how I write. And so they were able in some places to really condense that down. And I'm really pleased with the end product. I knew what the cover was going to look like, but I had no idea what the book would look like. And when I got the advanced copy, it was like, oh my. And then when I got the first box of books that go to, people and family, it was even more exciting. And then when I see it at NCECA, and I have a couple of book signings, it'll be even more exciting. And I hope that the book earns its place in the lexicon of ceramic books that can be used in your own studio, or it can also be used as a book to teach from. And I just wanted to put the information out there and tell the story.
To wrap up, can you plug those book signings at NCECA so people can come see you?
Sure. There are 2 book signings, Wednesday at 1:00 at the American Ceramic Society booth, and Friday at 11:00, same place. And they're just for an hour. I'd love to autograph your book. And I have, as a matter of fact, I have some stickers to give away. So, avoid plaster disasters. And, it's a wonderful thing to look at how my career has evolved. In 56 years of doing this, I mean, sure, I've always made stuff, but I've always included other people on this path, because if you don't, ceramics is just this kind of, it can be very isolating, and it can be very particularly individual, where you don't talk to anybody, you don't see anybody, you just make stuff and sell it. I don't think of ceramics as that. It's all about the people, and the people who make stuff, and how we can help each other.
Well, thanks for your time today. I certainly appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate this.
I'd like to thank Jonathan for coming on the show. I appreciate him talking about his experience. As you heard at the end, he's going to be having book signings for The Mold Making Manual, his newly released book by the American Ceramic Society. And while you're in the NCECA Expo, make sure to stop by the Archie Bray booth, where you can sign up for a giveaway. We're going to be giving away some merch. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art and the Archie Bray Clay Business. If you'd like to be a sponsor on the show, we would love to have you. You can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be taking next week off, as I'll be down for the conference in Richmond, but I'll be back the week after that. And as always, thank you all for tuning in.
If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.